Dandavat Pranam, Namaste. Here with Srimati Kanupriya Devidasi, and we are continuing with our reading of Hegel's Aesthetics. Still, we are in the introduction. Historical deduction of the true concept of art. Now, starting from this point of view in which consideration of the matter by the understanding's abstract reflection is dissolved, we must proceed to grasp the concept of art in its inner necessity, as well as after all, it was from this view, too, that the true reverence and understanding of art arose historically. For that opposition on which we touched asserted itself not in the abstract reflection of general culture, but even in philosophy as such, and only now, when philosophy has thoroughly understood how to overcome this opposition, has it grasped its own essence and therefore at the same time the essence of nature and art. So this point of view is not only the reawakening of philosophy in general, but also the reawakening of the science of art. Indeed, it is this reawakening alone that aesthetics proper as a science has really to thank for its genuine origin and for its higher estimation. I will therefore touch briefly on the history of the transition which I have in mind, partly from the sake of the history itself, partly because in this way there are more closely indicated the views which are important and on which as a foundation we will build further. This foundation in its most general character consists in recognizing that the beauty of art is one of the means which dissolve and reduce to unity the above-mentioned opposition and contradiction between the abstractly self-concentrated spirit and nature, both the nature of external phenomena and that of inner subjective feeling and emotion. The Kantian philosophy. It is the Kantian philosophy which has not only felt the need for this point of union, but has also clearly recognized it and brought it before our minds. In general, as the foundation alike of intelligence and will, Kant took self-related rationality, freedom, self-consciousness, finding and knowing itself as inherently infinite. This recognition of the absoluteness of reason in itself, which has occasioned philosophy's turning point in modern times, this absolute starting point must be recognized, and even if we pronounce Kant's philosophy to be inadequate, this feature in it is not to be refuted. But since Kant fell back again into the fixed opposition between subjective thinking and objective things, between the abstract universality and the sensuous individuality of the will, it was above all who emphasized as a supreme the aforementioned opposition in the moral life, since besides he exalted the practical side of the spirit above the theoretical. Having accepted this fixity of opposition recognized by the thinking of understanding, he was left with no alternative but to express the unity purely in the form of subjective ideas of reason, for which no adequate reality could be demonstrated, and therefore as postulates which indeed are to be deduced from the practical reason, but whose essential inner character remained unknowable by thinking and whose practical fulfillment remained a mere ought steadily deferred to infinity. And so Kant had indeed brought the reconciled contradiction before our minds, but yet could neither develop its true essence scientifically nor demonstrate it as what is truly and alone actual. It is true that Kant did press on still further insofar as he found the required unity in what he called the intuitive understanding, but even here he stopped again at the opposition of the subjective to the objective. So that while he does affirm the abstract dissolution of the opposition between the concept and reality, universal and particular, understanding and sense, and therefore the idea He makes this dissolution and reconciliation itself into a purely subjective one again, not one absolutely true and actual. In this connection, his critique of the power of judgment, in which he deals with the aesthetic and teleological powers of judgment, is instructive and remarkable. The beautiful objects of nature and art, the purposeful products of nature, through which Kant comes nearer to the concept of the organic and living, he treats only from the view of a reflection which judges them subjectively. And indeed, Kant defines the power of judgment in general as the ability to think the particular as contained under the universal. These quotations from the Critique of Judgment are from the 4th verse of the introduction. And he calls the power of judgment reflective, when it has only the particular given to it and has to find the universal under which it comes. To this end, it needs a law, a principle, which it has to give to itself. And as this law, Kant propounds purposiveness or teleology. In the concept of freedom and the critique of practical reason, the accomplishment of the end does not get beyond a mere ought, but in the teleological judgment of living things, Kant comes to the point of so regarding the living organism that in it the concept, the universal, contains particular too, and as an end it determines the particular and external, the disposition of the limbs, not from without but from within, in such a way that the particular corresponds to the end of its own accord. Yet once again, with such a judgment, the objective of the object is not supposed to be known. All that is expressed is a subjective mode of reflection. Similarly, Kant interprets the aesthetic judgment as proceeding neither from the understanding as such, as the capacity for concepts, nor from sensuous intuition and its manifold variety as such, but from the free play of understanding and imagination. In this concord of faculties of knowledge, the object becomes related to the subject and his feeling of pleasure and complacency. Now, in the first place, this complacency is to be devoid of all interest, i.e., to be without any relation to our appetitive faculty. If we have an interest, curiosity, for example, or a sensuous interest on behalf of our sensuous need, a desire for possession and use, then the objects are not important to us on their own account, but only because of our need. In that event, what exists has a value only in respect of such a need, and in the situation is such that on one side there is object and on the other a determinate need distinct from it, to which we yet relate it. If, for example, I consume an object for the sake of nourishment, this interest resides solely in me and is foreign to the object itself. Now, the situation with the beautiful, Kant maintains in his Critique of Judgment, Book 1, verse 2, that the beautiful is not of this kind. The aesthetic judgment lets the external existent subsist free and independent, and it proceeds from a pleasure to which the object on its own account corresponds. In that pleasure permits the object to have its end in itself. This, as we already saw above on page 36, is an important consideration. Secondly, the beautiful, Kant says in his Critique of Pure Judgment, Book 1, verse 6, should be that which is put before us without a concept, i.e., without a category of the understanding, as an object of universal pleasure. To estimate the beautiful requires a cultured spirit. The uneducated man has no judgment of the beautiful, since this judgment claims universal validity. True, the universal is as such prima facie in abstraction, but what is absolutely true carries in itself the demand for and the characteristic of universal validity. In this sense, the beautiful, too, ought to be universally recognized, although the mere concepts of the understanding are not competent to judge it. The good or the right, for example, in individual actions, is subsumed under universal concepts, and the action counts as good if it can correspond with these concepts. The beautiful, on the other hand, is to invoke a universal pleasure directly without any such relation or correspondence. This only means that in considering the beautiful, we are unaware of the concept and subsumption under it, and that the separation between the individual object and the universal concept, which elsewhere is present in judgment, is impermissible here. Thirdly, the beautiful is to have the form of purposiveness. Throughout this passage, Hegel is dealing with Kant and indicating his connection between artistic and teleological judgment. Zweck, I have to translate as purpose instead of end, and Zweckmäßigkeit as purposiveness. Bosanquet translate the latter by teleology, but he does sometimes translate Zweck by purpose. This first sentence is a quotation from Kant in his 17th verse of the previous book, Critique of Judgment. So, thirdly, the beautiful is to have the form of purposiveness, and as far as the purposiveness is perceived in the object without any presentation of a purpose. At bottom, this repeats what we have just discussed. Any natural product, a plant, for example, or an animal, is purposively organized. And in this purposiveness, it is so directly there for us that we have no idea of its purpose, explicitly separate and distinct from its present reality. In this way, the beautiful, too, is to appear to us as purposiveness, infinite purposiveness, end and means remain external to one another, since the end stands in no inner essential relation to the material of its realization. We make finite things for a purpose, e.g. a knife for cutting, but there is no essential relationship between the means and the end. Cutting can be done with a razor, but in an organism, limbs and life means the end. Means and end, limbs and life, means and end are related essentially. In this case, the idea of the end is explicitly distinguished from the object in which the end appears as realized. The beautiful, on the other hand, exists as purposeful in itself, without means and end showing themselves separated as different aspects of it. The purpose of the limbs, for example, of an organism is the life which exists as actual in the limbs themselves. Separated, they cease to be limbs. For in a living thing, purpose and the material for its realization are so directly united that it exists only in so far as its purpose dwells in. Looked at from this side, the beautiful should not wear purposiveness as an external form. On the contrary, the purposeful correspondence of inner and outer should be the immanent nature of the beautiful object. Fourthly, and lastly, Kant, in treating of the beautiful, holds firmly that it is recognized, without a concept, as the object of a necessary delight. from his Critique of Judgment, text 22. Necessity is an abstract category, and it indicates an inner essential relation of two sides. And if because the one is, so also the other is. The one in its specific character contains the other at the same time, as, for example, cause is meaningless without effect. Such a necessity of giving pleasure the beautiful has in itself, without any relation whatsoever to concepts, i.e., to the categories of understanding. So, for example, regularity, see below part 1, chapter 2b, 1a. Regularity, which is produced according to a category of the understanding, does please us, although Kant requires for pleasure still more than the unity and equality belonging to such a category of the understanding. Now, what we find in all these Kantian propositions is an inseparability of what, in all other cases, is presupposed in our consciousness as distinct. This cleavage finds itself cancelled in the beautiful, where universal and particular, and end and means, concept and object, perfectly interpenetrate one another. Thus, Kant sees the beauty of art, after all, as a correspondence in which the particular itself accords with the concept. Particulars as such are prima facie accidental, alike to one another and to the universal. And precisely this accidental element, sense, feeling, emotion, inclination, is now not simply in the beauty of art, subsumed under universal categories of the understanding, and dominated by the concept of freedom in its abstract universality, but is so bound up with the universal that it is inwardly and absolutely inadequate, adequate to it. Therefore, thought is incarnate in the beauty of art, and the material is not determined by thought externally, but exists freely on its own account, in that the natural, the sensuous, the heart, etc., have in themselves proportion, purpose, and harmony. And intuition and feeling are elevated to spiritual universality, just as thought not only renounces its hostility to nature, but is enlivened thereby. Feeling, pleasure, and enjoyment are justified and sanctified, so that nature and freedom, sense and concept, find their right and satisfaction all in one. But this apparently perfect reconciliation, still supposed by Kant at the last to be only subjective in respect of the judgment and the production of art, and not itself to be absolutely true and actual. These we may take to be the chief results of Kant's critique of judgment, insofar as they can interest us here. His critique constitutes the starting point for the true comprehension of the beauty of art. Yet only by overcoming Kant's deficiencies could this comprehension assert itself as the higher grasp of the true unity of necessity and freedom, particular and universal, sense and reason. Do you want to say anything, Judy?
No, it's interesting. I mean, it's a lot of what Maharaj talks about in class, which is interesting. So it's nice. You want to say anything?
think the main thing is that the beauty in art is not a mechanical principle, because mechanical principle means its purpose is only external to the machine. It has no internal purpose or necessity. And he was quoting Kant, specifically saying that that is not how art is, that the beauty in art needs to be, or the beauty in art is intrinsic to the art itself. So it's a teleological principle, not a mechanical principle. That seemed to be the one thing that stuck out to me.
Mm. Yeah.
And how he's saying here at the end, the higher grasp of the true unity of necessity and freedom, particular and universal, sense and reason. So on the one hand, some people are thinking art is only meant to be a very pretty thing. No deeper meaning has to be there as long as it just makes you feel good, on the one hand. And then maybe on the other hand is the extreme idea that what it actually looks like doesn't matter as long as it, communicates something very deep and meaningful. But I think what he's saying here is the unity of necessity and freedom, where it's not just one of two abstract poles, but both are there. Of course, this is aesthetic. The sensuous aspect is there necessarily, of the senses being pleasing to the senses, but that is there for the senses only because thought works through the senses to perceive things and learn from the environment. So it's a unity of basically, it's like mind body unity, matter and consciousness unity, or substance and thought, or thought and being. It's a unity of the two. It's not some abstract, purely ideal or purely material. It's both are real, and it's a dialectic relationship.
Yeah, I think the thing that stood out for me is where it's talked about in a way, and sort of understand it to be that, art in itself, like on its own, it has it, unless with its interaction, then it has its purpose in a sense. And there's that universal unity, I think, within that, no matter what different people are feeling or experiencing, or whether that within that idea of beauty. That's my understanding of what's been said. So
it froze right during what you were saying before the unity of the universal. Just like the sentence you said before that, the screen froze, so I couldn't hear what you said.
what did I say? I was so what I was saying is that art, and we was talking, we were reading, and it was talking about meaning, and this idea of something, like Maraj talks about, if the nose is a nose, but when it's not on the body, it's does it still become a nose, if you see what I mean? So it's like when it's talking about my understanding of like art as what its meaning or its beauty is, is different for each person who might be perceiving that piece of art in terms of their feelings and connection. But I think, it's the universal is that people are still going to be perceiving in some way some element of beauty within the art, depending on their, like you're saying, thoughts and feelings, etc., the senses, how they're perceiving. But the art itself is the art. So I think this idea of meaning is, and the universal is really relevant. Don't know if I'm being clear.
Yeah, I'm just listening.
But yeah, this I think, but it still brings up to the higher understanding or the higher purpose of art, because art in itself can just be, it's just art for the sake of art, then its purpose and its higher purpose becomes more beautiful. It can be beautiful just on a mundane level, on an aesthetic level, but real beauty, real sweetness is when it's connected to that higher plane.
I think so. One of the themes that he keeps repeating is that the concept is what makes the specific concept of the piece of art is what is the life of the art. Otherwise, it's just like a carcass, a dead body. And like you're
Yeah.
saying, the real value of the art is if it's connected with that higher plane, which means that as that plane is revealing itself through the conception,
Thought.
then yeah, through the specific thought, then basically that is the idea that is being transmitted through any piece of art. So, but there's two aspects where the artist may be aligned with that and trying to represent that in the painting or in the sculpture or whatever the piece of art is. So that's like the identity with that thought is there, but then the difference comes in people who are observing it. They just you get so many people thinking so many different things just from looking at one piece of art, and one some people might like to think that uh, all of the different perceptions that people have, that's all a part of it, but it might not be too. Like people might just be thinking some crazy thing or whatever, and it might not have anything
Yeah,
to do with what's actually trying to be said.
I know exactly. Exactly. I think that comes under like, the universal experience, that they're still going to have an experience, but depending on their conception and their experience and their understanding of things, they might perceive it totally differently. And that's what's so, again, that's a beautiful thing about art, is that people can connect to art, even though it might have a different purpose and a different meaning, but in a different way. They're still going to maybe have some connection or some reaction, even if it's that they don't like it. There's still a some sort of communication going on between the artwork and the viewer.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. It's like almost like it's a living thing, even though it's not. But it's living through the concept.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Should we read a little more? Or do you want
Up
to
to
do
you, probably. If you have time, it's up to you. Or you can conclude.
a little bit more if it's okay with
Yeah.
you?
Yeah.
Uh, Schiller, Winckelmann, and Schelling. Therefore, it has to be admitted that the artistic sense of a profound and philosophic mind has demanded and expressed totality and reconciliation earlier than philosophy as such had recognized them. As against that abstract endlessness of ratio, ratiocination, that duty for duty's sake, that formless intellectualism, which apprehends nature and actuality, sense and feeling, as just a barrier, just contradicting it and hostile. It is Schiller, who lived 1759 to 1805, who must be given great credit for breaking through the Kantian subjectivity and abstraction of thinking, for venturing on an attempt to get beyond this by intellectually grasping the unity and reconciliation as the truth and by actualizing them in artistic production. For Schiller, in his aesthetic writings, has not merely taken good note of art and its interest without any regard for its relation to philosophy proper, but he has also compared his interest in the beauty of art with philosophical principles, and only by starting from them and with their aid did he penetrate into the deeper nature and concept of the beautiful. Even so, one feels that at one point of his work, he busied himself with thought more even than was advantageous for the naive beauty of his works of art. Deliberate concentration on abstract reflections and even an interest in the philosophical concept is noticeable in many of his poems. From this he has been reproached and especially blamed and depreciated in comparison with Goethe's objectivity and his invariable naivety, steadily undisturbed by the concept. But in this respect, Schiller, as a poet, only paid the debt of his time, and what was to blame was a perplexity which turned out only to the honor of this sublime soul and profound mind, and only to the advantage of science and knowledge. At the same time, at the same period, this same scientific impulse withdrew Goethe from his proper sphere, poetry. Just as Schiller immersed himself in the consideration of the inner depths of the spirit, so Goethe pursued his own proper genius in the natural side of art and to external nature, to the organisms of plants and animals and crystals and the formation of clouds and colors. To this scientific research, Goethe brought his great genius, which in these subjects had altogether thrown to the winds the outlook of the mere understanding with its error. Just as Schiller, on the other side, had succeeded in asserting against the understanding's treatment of willing and thinking, the idea of the free totality of beauty. A number of Schiller's writings is devoted to this insight into nature of art, especially his letters on aesthetic education. In these letters, the chief point from which Schiller starts is that every individual man bears within himself the capacity for ideal manhood. This genuine man, he holds, is represented by the state, which he takes to be the objective universal, and as it were, canonical, form in which the diversity of individual persons aims at collecting and combining itself into a unity. Now he thought that there were two ways of presenting how man living in time might correspond with man in the idea. On the one hand, the state as the genus of ethics, law, and intelligence might cancel individuality. On the other hand, individual might raise himself to the genus, and the man of time ennoble himself into the man of the idea. Reason, he thinks, demands unity as such, what accords with the genus, while nature demands multiplicity and individuality. And both of these legislatures make equal claims on man. Now, in the conflict of these opposite sides, aesthetic education is precisely to actualize the demand for their meditation and reconciliation, since according to Schiller, it proceeds by so developing inclination, sensuousness, impulse, and art that they become rational in themselves. And in this way, reason too, freedom, and spirituality emerge from their abstraction and united with that element, that natural element, now rationalized, acquire flesh and blood in it. The beautiful is thus pronounced to be the mutual formation of the rational and the sensuous, and this formation to be genuinely actual. In general, this view of Schiller's can be recognized already in his Anmut und Würde, Grace and Dignity, from 1793, as well as in his poems, because he makes the praise of women his special subject matter, and for in their character he recognized and emphasized just that spontaneously present unification of spirit and nature. This unity of universal and particular, freedom and necessity, spirit and nature, which Schiller grasped scientifically as the principle of essence of art, and which he labored unremittingly to call into actual life by art and aesthetic education, has now, as the idea itself, been made the principle of knowledge and existence, and the idea has become recognized as that which alone is true and actual. Thereby, philosophy has attained, with Schelling, who lives from 1775 to 1854, see his System of Transcendental Idealism from 1800. Okay. Thereby, philosophy has attained, with Schelling, its absolute standpoint. And while art had already begun to assert its proper nature and dignity in relation to the highest interests of mankind, it was now that the concept of art and the place of art in philosophy was discovered, and art has been accepted, even if in one aspect in a distorted way, which is not the place, which this is not the place to discuss, still in its high and genuine vocation. Likewise, Winckelmann, in his History of Art in Antiquity from 1764, at an earlier date was inspired by his insight into the ideals of the Greeks in a way whereby he opened up a new sense for considering art. He rescued it from the ways of regarding it as serving common ends or merely imitating nature, and has powerfully encouraged the discovery of the idea of art in works of art and the history of art. For Winckelmann is to be regarded as one of the men who in the field of art have opened up for the spirit a new organ and totally new modes of treatment. Still, on the theory and philosophical knowledge of art, his view has had less influence. To touch briefly on the course of the further development of the subject alongside the reawakening of the philosophical idea, A.W. and Friedrich von Schlegel, who lived 1769 to 1845, A.W. lived 1769 to 1845, and Friedrich von Schlegel lived 1772 to 1829. They both, greedy for novelty and in the search of the distinctive and extraordinary, appropriated from the philosophical idea as much as their completely non-philosophical but essentially critical natures were capable of accepting. For neither of them can claim a reputation for speculative thought. Nevertheless, it was they who, with their critical talent, put themselves near the standpoint of the idea, and with great freedom of speech and boldness of innovation, even if with miserable philosophical ingredients, directed a spirited polemic against the views of their predecessors. And thus, in different branches of art, they did introduce a new standard of judgment and new considerations which were higher than those they attacked. But since their criticism was not accompanied by thoroughly philosophical knowledge of their standard, this standard retained a somewhat indefinite and vacillating character, so that they sometimes achieved too much, sometimes too little. It must also be put to their credit that they brought to light again and lovingly exalted things that were antiquated and too little valued at the time. as for instance the older Italian and Dutch painting, Nibelungenlied, etc., and that they endeavored with enthusiasm to learn and teach little known, like Indian poetry and mythology. Teach little known things like Indian poetry and mythology. But however high their credit is for this, they too set high a value on these epochs, and sometimes fell into the error of admiring the mediocre, e.g., Holberg's comedies. Baronel Holberg, 1684 to 1754, a Danish dramatist and historian. So Holberg's his comedies of ascribing universal worth to what was only relatively valuable, or even having the audacity to show themselves enthused by a perverse tendency and subordinate standpoint, as if it were something supreme. I think this is a good place to stop. So he's just continuing with this historical account for now. And it was definitely important to hear Kant's perspective, though, because Maharaj talks about Kant a lot, and he had a lot of valuable ideas about consciousness and matter, the relationship between the two, and also Kant was the first one to really talk about the noumenal, where phenomenal means the sense perception, but noumenal means the thing in itself, the absolute. But Kant's mistake was that he thought the noumenal was unknowable, although he admitted it exists. You can't know about the thing in itself. You can only know about what things are for consciousness, for our conscious experience. But then Hegel came and he said, no, the noumenal is showing certain aspects of itself through how it appears to our consciousness. Although it can't, what our consciousness is experiencing isn't the whole thing, isn't the whole noumenal, it's a part of it. And then through further mediated thought, through reason, further mediated thought in a dialectic way, and you can come to know spirit, actually, which is the noumenal. But anyway, so this is nice. I feel very aesthetic, sorry.
So I just said to know something of the absolute.
Yeah, through, I mean, it's revealing itself as a part of it. Only when we are understanding ourselves as a finite part of the absolute, then we can know something about the absolute as it is for itself. But if we're thinking that we are something isolated and separate, and we can only have illusion.
Yeah. Nice.
So very fortunate to be here reading this with you, continuing with the Association of the Devotees under the guidance of Spiritual Master. Feel very fortunate. So thank you for your association, Didi.
Thank you, Prabhu, making this happen. And by the grace of Madhu Puri Maharaj.
Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Shripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Srila Prabhupada, Srila Guru Maharaj, Srila Gurudev, Srila Acharya Dev, Srila Shanta Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Rupanuga Guru Varga Ki Jai. Jai Navadvip Dham Ki Jai. Nishringapali Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai. Baladev Subhadra Jagannath Ju Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Yamuna Mai Ki Jai. Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Gira Govardhan Gupta Govardhan Dham Ki Jai. Sham Kund Radha Kund Ki Jai. Tulsi Devi, Bhakti Devi, Vrinda Devi Ki Jai. Jai Harinam Sankirtan Yajna Ki Jai. Scientific Sankirtan Yajna Ki Jai. Jai Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute Ki Jai. Shri Chaitanya Saraswat Institute Ki Jai. Shri Chaitanya Saraswat Mat Ki Jai. A glory to the assembled devotees, a glory to the worldwide devotees, Sama Bhaktiveda Vrinda Ki Jai. Jai Srimati Priya Devi Dasi Ki Jai.
Krishna Kejavadas Prabhu Ki Jai. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you, Didi. Jai
Dhanyavad.
Gurudev. Dhanyavad Pranam.
Dhanyavad.